All right, we'll go ahead and start. Good morning, and thank you for joining New Jersey Audubon's webinar on healthy forests, the third in our series. Today's webinar is Nature-Based Solutions, Carbon in Healthy Forest Ecosystems. I'm Eileen Murphy, Vice President for Government Relations at New Jersey Audubon, and welcome. Before introducing our panelist guests, I want to take a moment to go over the webinar features, although you're probably all familiar with that by now. You'll notice there's a Q&A at the bottom where I will ask you to post your questions at any time during the webinar as you think of them. Well, we won't be taking questions immediately after each presenter. They'll be addressed at the end all together. And Drew Tompkins, give a wave. He's our policy director at New Jersey Audubon. We'll be scanning the Q&A, lumping questions together, putting similar questions together. And if your question has been answered by a subsequent speaker, we'll make a note of that. So that's how we are going to handle the Q&As. The webinar is being recorded so that colleagues who cannot attend in person can listen at another time. And I hope that you'll attend additional webinars that we're hoping to schedule later in the year. This one again focused on carbon. We hope to have one maybe on deer management. And also we'll take suggestions from anyone attending. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce our panelists. Dr. Robert Mendelson is the Edwin Weyerhaeuser Davis Professor at Yale University and is a resource economist who specializes in valuing the environment. He has specialized in quantifying the benefits of environmental management. An important aspect of his climate research is studying how people, farms, and firms adapt to climate in different places. Dr. Julia Burton is an associate professor at Michigan Technological University and an adjunct associate professor at SUNY's College of Environmental Science and Forestry. Her research examines the role of civiculture in sustaining a broad range of values, functions, and services in forests, such as carbon sequestration, wildlife habitat, biodiversity, and cultural values, as well as timber production. Dr. Karina Schaefer is an associate professor at Rutgers Newark, and her primary research interests lie in the realm of global change and its effects on terrestrial ecosystems. To this point, her research has focused on refining carbon budgets of forest ecosystems. And Bernie Isaacson is an assistant regional forester with New Jersey Forest Service and a PhD candidate at Rutgers University. His research focuses on using remote sensing and forest inventory to describe the relationships between forest occupancy and competing natural resource objectives, such as water availability, habitat, forest health, and forest carbon. And we're delighted to have this panel of experts with us here in New Jersey to talk about forest carbon. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Bernie Isaacson to kick us off. Thanks, Bernie.
All right, so hopefully everyone can see the this first slide here. I wanted to start off by saying thank you to Eileen and to New Jersey Audubon for hosting this webinar and for hosting this series. And I wanted to say also thank you to all our participants today, everyone who's listening in. As someone who has a background in natural resources and trying to manage for lots of different objectives, it means a lot to me that there's this much interest. I can't think of hardly anything worse than apathy. So thanks for all coming today. So my talk's going to be broken into two parts. Part one, right now, this is going to be about concepts. You're going to see a little bit of it, a little bit more in context. It's New Jersey specific. Part two later. So the concepts, there's some core concepts that hopefully, as we go over them and as you hear them now, it'll help to sort of enhance, enrich the presentations that you hear going forward. Hopefully, you can think about these concepts with our next speakers. And then when we get to context and part two, that's more very New Jersey specific numbers. So the first concept I think is really important to discuss, to bring up. One of the things I think is like one of the biggest sticking points in our conversations about forest carbon has to do with the use of the word sequestration. That some folks, I think a lot of times we talk past each other when we use that word, because some folks use it as the amount of carbon that's stored, and some folks refer to it as the amount of carbon that's being actively pulled out. So this figure is from the State of the Carbon Cycle 2 report it's a federal publication. It's a simplified graphic of the carbon cycle. So the cuboid shapes The three-dimensional shapes are pools of carbon. Carbon that's in a physical state in one of those regions. And then the arrows are fluxes. So carbon that's moving, it's a rate of change. Forests occupy two parts of that. There's the pool of carbon that's already locked up in the vegetation, in the soils. And then there's the carbon that's being actively pulled out as in a rate. So carbon per unit time. And so it's important to make a distinction between those two when we talk about carbon and sequestration. Some people say, oh, young forests sequester more, old forests sequester more. It has to do with how you're using the word sequester, whether you're referring to the flux or the pool. Another concept that's really important to consider is leakage. So leakage is what happens when your carbon policy doesn't necessarily track with how you're doing the accounting. So this is a unnamed store in New Jersey. It might be familiar to some of you just based on the appearance. And being a forester, I see pallets of firewood, and of course I have to go over and take a picture of the label. It's got this handy fellow with a cap and a cat and a pipe, and the wood comes from Latvia. And so when we think about leakage, policies that keep carbon in New Jersey's forests but don't do anything to address demand so that the firewood is still being purchased and still being burned, they don't necessarily account for leakage in the carbon budget. So there's still emissions associated with burning wood, but the cost to the forest, at least the forest role there, in this case, it's not accounted for. It's coming from another country. Contrast that with, I was at a roadside stand and again, seeing bags of firewood. I can't help myself in Pennsylvania, seeing that this is wood that came from Pennsylvania. So when it comes to an accounting perspective, this wood has been accounted for in the budget, in the carbon budget. So when we're setting policy. Another concept that's really important is baseline and additionality. So people have talked about selling carbon credits as a way to finance either acquisition or stewardship of public lands or open space. In order to sell credits, you need to demonstrate additionality. So baseline, this brown line here, that's the units of carbon over time. You see how they're stable. So stable baseline, whatever action you take would have to add to that in order to sell credits. So you wouldn't sell credits based off of what's underneath the line, the baseline. You'd sell it based off of the difference between what you're doing and that baseline. And so this is assuming a baseline that's stable, but baselines don't necessarily have to be stable. It depends on how they're formulated. So this is an increasing baseline. You see the additionality that would be there. A declining baseline, the additionality, what you'd have to do to forestall some losses. So baseline and additionality are really critical concepts for selling credits. And the last concept that I'd like to touch on that I think would be really helpful is biophysical limits. There is a biophysical limit to the relationship between size and density. This happens to be in sunflower, and I did that because it's not unique to forests. It's unique to populations. So this is number of plants per unit area and average plant weight. So think of that as, let's say, carbon. So this would be the above ground pool. It doesn't consider the other pools, right? The soil organic carbon. But as we follow these 800 trees, they start to compete with each other as they approach that biophysical limit. And then as they keep growing in size along here in the Y, they're going to decrease in number. And so that limit is a relatively hard limit. It can vary where it is by species and forest type, but that's there are physical limits to how much carbon you can fit in an ecosystem. All right, so with that, I'm going to pause and hand it off.
Okay, thanks, Bernie. I think Robert Mendelson is up.
Okay. So what I would like to talk about today, I'm very appreciative as well about being invited. And what I'd like to talk about today is what's the relationship between carbon forests and between carbon and forests, and what the relationship is between carbon and climate change. So one of the very first things to talk about, again, trying to just lay the groundwork as to why we're concerned about carbon, is there's a relationship between carbon and the temperature of the planet. So if we continue to emit as much carbon as we have in the past, we're going to keep moving along this upper line, this business as usual. And it turns out that eventually that's going to lead to really high global temperatures. So if we want to control the size of future temperatures, we're going to have to start doing some mitigation. And that is making a gap between the business as usual and a particular plan. So the lower the temperature we want as a final product, the more mitigation we must do. And it turns out that this involves many, many billions of tons of carbon dioxide that has to be removed from emissions. And it's not that easy to do that. It's not that easy to find silver bullets, things that will actually remove carbon. And so one of the things that's important to understand is that forests actually are very good at doing mitigation. They can't do all the mitigation we need, but it turns out they're capable of doing a substantial amount. So one of the reasons we're talking about carbon in forests is that we actually want to use forests as one of our major methods of doing sequestration or doing mitigation in general. So how does that work? What Bernie was just telling you a second ago is the way forests grow is they take carbon dioxide from the atmosphere and they store it inside the tree, especially as wood. And so as trees grow, they're gradually taking more and more carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And that is reducing the amount of carbon in the atmosphere. So this is why they're actually forests are very good at removing carbon emissions. They're essentially, for every ton of carbon emissions they can take from the atmosphere, that's equal to a ton of carbon that otherwise would be out there. So one of the reasons we're interested in forests is that as they grow, they are actually securing more and more atmospheric CO2. And when we look at that, one of the things we found is that encouraging forests to take more biomass, and particularly more biomass in the live part of the forest, it turns out that's relatively inexpensive. And so when we compare it to other ways we can try to get rid of carbon dioxide, other things we can do in the energy sector, we think forest management is one of our most important mitigation devices. It's not the only one by any means, but we think it can do up to 25% of the global mitigation that we need. So we want to depend on forests as a method of doing mitigation. And how much mitigation we want from the carbon from the forest depends, again, back on this diagram before, what temperature do we want to finally have? If we're willing to accept the 4-degree target, then we don't need that much mitigation. But as we try to push harder and harder to go from 4 to 3 to 2 degrees, we need more and more mitigation to occur, in which case it's more and more important that we actually use forests as a device to do carbon. So there are going to be different things we want out of forests. And one of the things I'm pressing for is that if we care about climate change, one of the things we definitely want forests to do is store more carbon. So one of the things we're going to press the forest to do is try to sequester more carbon inside it. And what we're effectively arguing is we want the forest to grow more and to contain that forest in the biomass of the forest. But one of the things that's also true about forests, so sequestration is super important, and that's something we need to do right away. But one of the things in the long run, if you look at these dramatic targets like 2 degrees, one of the things in the long run is we expect to actually, with the 2-degree target, drive emissions to zero by something around 2050 in order to reach that target. And if that's true, it turns out that there are no more emissions in the globe at that point. What this is saying is by 2050, we're going to drive out all global emissions. But even so, it turns out we have still too high a concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. So one of the things that is true, if we want to get these super low targets on temperature, we're going to have a period where we're drawing carbon out of the atmosphere. That's this negative emissions period. And it turns out negative emissions, there aren't very many methods we have at the moment to do negative emissions. And forests are, again, one of the few ways we know how to do this. So in addition to doing sequestration, it turns out we want to also, in the long run, that is by the second half of the century, if we're going to be shooting for these low temperature targets, we're also going to want to use forests to remove carbon from the atmosphere. And so what we want to do in this case is get to zero emissions and then start to use the forest to try to get atmospheric CO2 out of CO2 out of the atmosphere. And the way to do that is to go to a form of forest management where we're growing the trees as fast as we can. That is, we're getting them to their highest average growth. And that's what's called in forestry, that's called maximum sustained yield. But in this case, it's not the yield we're after. is not a timber yield. What we're actually after is a carbon yield. And so what we're trying to do is to use the forest to grab carbon, not to create timber for markets, but to actually to grab carbon. And there's two ways we can do it. We can grow the trees and then cut them down and put them in mines or other places where they're going to permanently be stored. Or the other way to do this is we could burn the trees for energy. So it would be a source of energy for us. It would help with our energy needs after we go to this zero carbon society. And then capture the CO2 while we're burning it and get that CO2, then put it underneath the ground. So carbon capture and storage. So that's the second way we could do this. And what this means in the long run is that we'll be actually using forests no longer as a storage device, but now as a carbon removal device. So the forest will actually be helping us vacuum CO2 out of the atmosphere. And again, that's expensive. So we'll be probably only doing that in the latter half of the century. And there's one final other thing to talk about. It turns out that even with 2 degrees, we're still going to get some warming. We'll get warming up to 2 degrees. If we can't hit 2 degrees, we're going to see even more warming. So one of the things that is going to happen is there is still going to be some climate change. That is one of the things you should brace yourself for. That is, we will still see, especially this century, some climate change. So one of the other things that has to happen is forests have to adapt to global warming. And one of the things that ecologists have been studying is, well, how have forests adapted to climate change in the past? There's been lots of natural causes of climate to move around in the past, and ecosystems have all survived that in the past. So how did they survive it? And it turns out there's lots of evidence to suggest that ecosystems survive past changes in climate by moving. They move towards the poles in warm periods, and they move towards the equator in cold periods. And that idea is in some sense what we expect to happen in the future. As we continue to warm the planet, what we're going to expect is ecosystems will in fact move towards the poles and also to higher altitudes. And we also expect that the forests themselves will change. So there's going to be, the climate change is going to cause ecosystems to move dramatically, but it's also going to have direct effects on the forests themselves. Warmer temperatures, higher precipitation, and more CO2 in the atmosphere are a combination that generally is good for forests. That if you ask them if forests could vote whether we want climate change, it turns out they probably would say, yes, we do actually, because with this warmer world, at least up to a point, up to 5 degrees or so, forests are expected to expand. They're also expected to grow faster. So what we're expecting is that climate change will cause forests to change a lot. And one of the things that that's suggesting is if we're thinking about how to manage forests, we probably ought to be thinking about not how to manage forests today, but how to manage forests as they change. And what the general message is, as the climate gets warmer, forests are going to want to be different. And we should try to manage for the forest that wants to be there in that future climate. And if we can do that, what we're going to have is a slightly different kind of forest management, a forest management that is dynamic, that will move as climate change moves. So if new ecosystems want to replace some of the ecosystems that are in New Jersey today, if we have new hardwoods that want to replace the existing hardwoods, the idea is instead of fighting that, it could be that what we should be doing is as the century progresses and it gets warmer, we should be encouraging that change and helping the forest adapt to the climate that's coming. So between the adaptation and pulling carbon out of the atmosphere and storing carbon, it turns out there's a huge role for forests in carbon management. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. That was really interesting. Okay, we're going to, Karina Schaefer is up next.
Thank you. I will continue right on with that and actually talk about what is with the boots on the ground, so to speak, actually happening to our forests and what climate change actually does to our forests. So I will also, as Bernie, go into some definitions. Oh, sorry, that was a bit faster than I wanted to. So forest canopy gaps is one of the issues that I want to go through the definitions real quick. Is any gap that will open up the canopy so that light will penetrate all the way to the ground. And usually that's caused by anthropogenic or by natural disturbances, as we call in forest ecology. Disturbance is when the integrity of a forest is compromised in any way, in shape or form. And that reduces, like mentioned, the canopy foliage. Fragmentation, that is any size or significant size of a forest gap that is created that causes interruptions in the habitat or functionality of a forest. And that depends actually of the species that we want to look at. Whoops, sorry. So for ant, a little tiny path is already an interruption, and for bigger animals or tree species, it will be a larger path that would cause that fragmentation to happen. So it really depends also on the organism that we are looking at and what kind of disruption is caused by that. If animals cannot find mates and things of that nature is already considered fragmentation and a huge impact to populations. Intact forest here in this context, and also in the research that I will be presenting about, is considered that all ecosystem services are provided, which is not only carbon sequestration, as we have been talking about, but also biodiversity is encompassed, watershed, for example, to have clean water, etc. So those are also ecosystem services that we actually ask for from forests. For example, for urban forests, we would also hope to have temperature regulation, as we have dealing with urban heat island effect, and where we see that forest cover or plant cover will mitigate this. But should be also noted in an intact forest, a canopy gap that, for example, a fallen tree would not create as much of a gap because there's already sufficient undergrowth to basically make up for this canopy gap. So an intact forest with a in jargon, nearest neighbor analyses would suggest that you have enough undergrowth, at least trees more than 5 meters tall, that have enough foliage that if a tree falls down, we have already canopy cover that would fill in the gap quickly, and therefore you would not have as much of a dramatic impact. And resilience and resistance is really how quickly and how much you can withstand disturbances. So those are a couple of definitions and terminologies that I hope you will keep in mind as I will go along and actually narrate as to what the boots on the ground have actually found, what's happening to our forests. And as the previous speaker has already pointed out, we are already entering the era of impacts, unintended consequences, if you wish, of climate change. So, quick context, what do I mean with climate change? Obviously, we are all familiar with the increase in carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide is the food for plants, so obviously a lot of folks have thought that we could increase carbon sequestration simply by having the trees or plants in general taking up CO2, and higher CO2 is more food. That is one of the notions that we have. We have already a 1.07 degrees Celsius increase. That means we have warmer temperatures. And with that, we have also an increase in storms, floods, droughts, etc. So climate change is already here. We don't need to argue about that. And it's not something that's in the near future. It is already here. And as already pointed out, the climate change is not only caused by fossil fuel combustion per se, but also changes in land use, forestry, and agriculture. And that is also the pie slice where we have right now perhaps the largest impact when And of course, and I'm not talking about that today, this is another subject altogether, reducing CO2 emissions per se with changing the energy sources that we use, or industries and buildings, etc. That's not topic of this talk, obviously, but just to put it into context that our management of terrestrial ecosystems alone are already a quarter of the pie that are a culprit in the climate change malaise that we are in. So what happens when we have elevated CO2? There are three scenarios that we could think of what happens to trees. One is that they grow faster, which is the first hypothesis, and they will die at the same time than they usually do, which is here in an elevated CO2 scenario. The trees take up more CO2 and die at the same time. The second hypothesis is that they actually grow even bigger, that the trees will actually extend their growth and can technically, per tree, also become larger than before because of the elevated CO2. And the last one, H3, would suggest that the trees will not only grow faster, but also die faster, which also means that they will not be able to sequester as much for the length of time because they also will die faster. So obviously those are all long-term. So a mid-sized tree is roughly at 50 to 100 years. If we talk about old growth forests, that's 200 years. So these are actually time spans that is already going beyond this century. So we don't really know which trees are doing what, and whether we have, for example, the third hypothesis would suggest to us that the trees will be also dying and the turnover rate would be faster, which obviously would not be very helpful in storing carbon. So another issue that we talked about is the floods, droughts, etc. And anthropogenic climate change has exacerbated these disturbances that I was defining at the beginning, where trees die and fall over and create forest gaps, etc. So we have climate has direct effects and indirect effects. So climate, as mentioned, as increased CO2 and temperature, will also, for example, and I know Bernie will be talking about that a little bit more, we have, for example, higher insect pests. For example, we have the southern pine beetle that's coming from the south and overrunning New Jersey. If we would have more cold snaps in the winter, we would have more dieback of those insects. However, if these cold snaps are reduced, we will even more have insect pressures. And for example, snow and ice. Some of you may be still familiar with a few years ago at Halloween, when the trees have not yet shed their foliage, we had a huge freak snowstorm, if you wish, and it caused a lot of damage to the forests and trees, especially power lines and power outages, etc. This was a relatively recent, and these are things that are already part of our climate change that we are experiencing. Wind. We have had Ida just 6 weeks ago, and it has, in many forests that I also do some research here in New Jersey, had several trees being pulled down. Last year, Isaias, I may pronounce that wrong, I'm sorry, has also caused a lot of damage in the woodlands and forests in New Jersey as the wind has blown through. Drought. We had in 2011 a quite severe drought, and in conjunction with insects, we had actually in New Jersey a 30% forest die-off because we had these double whammy of insect pest and drought that has done in a lot of our trees. Fire, I don't think we need to elaborate on that too much. However, New Jersey does manage fire through prescribed fires, and so we luckily do not have as much wildfires than we have experienced in California, but I don't think the devastation in California can be overemphasized as to the destruction that obviously fire has. So these pressures are already on our forests, right here, right there, right now. And they will be exacerbated in time to come, as a matter of fact. And we are in a rat race, if you wish, to save as much as we actually can in order to even get to the stage of additionality that Bernie already had mentioned. So canopy gaps, as a recent study has actually found, actually creates a reduction in thermal buffering. What do I mean by that is that microclimatic is what we experience within the forest. Macroclimate is the global warming that we have been narrating about. And the baseline survey, if we have 15 years ago or so, 22 degrees, and we have now 24 degrees, the intact forest will have thermal buffering, and the understory will experience, for example, in this example, 20 degrees Celsius. However, if you have forest gaps and you have actually heating, that will then decrease the thermal buffering in the understory. What that also means is that in microclimatic changes, we'll also have dramatic changes as to what resilience and resistance this forest has to other drivers. What I mean by that is we have more drought, for example, because with higher temperatures, you have more evaporation of soil, water, you have also a change in species composition that cannot deal with higher temperatures in the understory. And various other effects. If we go even in a global scale, for example, these effects have caused fires in the Amazon now by having forest gaps that dry out edges. So in a greater scheme of things, it can have larger impacts to have microclimatic changes and not only macroclimatic changes. And that means, again, that if we want to have a resilient forest, we need to make sure that the forest is intact. Intact, again, meaning minimizing the gaps, having enough understory and regrowth to have 100% canopy cover, and being able to withstand shocks to the system. Intact forest in the northeastern United States, what does that mean? We have to actually go fairly far. What this map actually shows is the next or closest intact forest is actually in Vermont. We do not have intact forest in New Jersey. We are too fragmented and too many forest gaps, if you wish. And so this forest map is actually from 2016. If anyone is interested, I'm happy to share the linkage, which is here in Earth Engine. It is a recent publication also from 2020 that have done extensive research in finding out where the last intact forest systems are. And again, repeating my earlier argument, we can only build resilience and resistance in this forest against climate shocks and other anthropogenic pressures if we have intact forest landscapes. And New Jersey actually does not have as such. So forest losses actually outpace our capacity to adapt. What does that mean? We have a lot of pressures such as pest infestations, fire, droughts. Again, I cannot re-emphasize the fact that we lost a lot of acres and acres of forest in the West because of fires. And for example, also what we have seen previously and what I already mentioned Insect defoliation and drought, the double whammy has killed 30% actually of the New Jersey pine barrens between 2007 and 2012. Also, most of you will be familiar with hemlock. Woolly adelgid has diminished a lot of hemlock stains, the emerald ash borer, the southern pine beetle, gypsy moth, various insects are obviously attacking various forest species, and the forest species will be less able to withstand further pressures if they're under drought or if obviously the wind is blowing them down. So you can only withstand shocks if you're resilient, and you can only be resilient if you're intact. So another way of looking what is happening in New Jersey, again, a recent forest map, is continuously we are actually losing more forests in New Jersey than we are gaining. And this map again is from 2016 and is looking at the red one here is showing the forest losses between 2000 and 2020. The forest gain, we have some gains are the blue. Both losses and gains here is the purple. And overall, it becomes clear that we are losing more forest than we are gaining. So again, our capacity to withstand shocks, to be resilient and to build an intact forest will depend on how we actually stop losing forest in the first place before we can even think of building upon that to sequester more carbon.
Karina, you're down to your last minute. I'm just your 1 minute warning.
Yes. Okay. So the threats here, a little bit of tongue in cheek. The threat is also for regeneration and getting to full and intact forests is deer. We have a huge issue with deer that are not allowing our forests to recover properly. And here a little bit, the wolf would be a solution, but I'm not going to go there. In Yellowstone, it works, may not work in New Jersey, of course. But in the summary, there, according to the definitions that I also let bear, is that we don't have really intact forest. We are losing more forest than we are gaining at the moment. And in order to increase the integrity of forests, we will have to increase the resilience to climate change, sequester carbon, or continue to provide ecosystems services that we need. We also have forests here, obviously, for water provisions. And New Jersey will require, obviously, deer management. That's another webinar. We have heard about that before, but also reforestation, proforestation, afforestation, any forestation you can possibly think of in order to prevent and become more resilient. So I am at my last minute, so I will stop sharing and.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. And then our next panel speaker is Julia Burton.
How is that? Can you guys see that?
Yeah, you were on mute before, so you're unmuted now. We can see your slide, Julia.
Okay, great. Sorry, let's see. Here we go. Okay, so today I want to talk about how silvicultural forest management can be used to manage forest carbon in forest ecosystems. So kind of building on these big picture issues that have already been discussed to talk about and think about, well, what can we do to manage this? And silviculture is the process of tending and regenerating forests for specific management objectives. And we know that forests provide a valuable range of ecosystem services and goods beyond timber production, from wildlife habitat to biodiversity. And silvicultural management is increasingly accommodating this broader range of management objectives. And we have these tools that we can now apply to managing carbon. But that must be done in the context of all these other values and services that we manage forests for. So kind of zooming in at all those pools and fluxes that Bernie introduced, I want to kind of zoom in on the major pools or stocks. If we define carbon stocks as the total amount of carbon in a forest at a given time, we have live versus detrital, live versus dead trees, trees above ground, roots below ground, detrital, organic matter below ground. The soil is actually the largest pool of carbon, the largest stock, followed by the overstory. Additionally, we have, I'm going to call it a sequestration rate to distinguish between the flux, the change in carbon over time, or the rate of uptake from the atmosphere from the stock or the storage. So those fluxes are the net effects of uptake and respiration from the trees and the soils. We remove timber, we remove wood from the forest in a timber harvest, and that carbon can then be stored in wood products offsite, whether those are short-lived products like paper products or long-lived products like furniture that can have significant effects on reducing the need for other products that are more carbon demanding, like concrete, that demand a lot of fossil fuels, plastics. So there are some important substitution effects that we need to consider when we're thinking about managing the carbon balance of forests in a managed forest. So over time, after a large disturbance, carbon accumulates over time very slowly initially, and then at a very high rate, and then that reaches an asymptote. With forest management, we reduce, or not all forest management, when we're harvesting, we reduce the standing carbon stock or carbon storage. And this concentrates growth on remaining trees, and those individual trees grow faster because they have more resources. And if we do this over time, those trees, we're removing trees that would have been lost due to self-thinning, that relationship that Bernie mentioned, the size-density relationship. We can actually sequester more carbon over a rotation compared to an unthinned stand. And this is due to the combination of carbon stored and harvested wood products, losses, we reduce losses to mortality, and we have that increased surplus growth. So we extend the time at which forests are, those individual trees and forests are growing at that really fast rate. So that asymptote happens later. Sorry, I'm messing up my slides here. Okay, so however, keeping forests growing at that maximum rate is how you can maximize carbon sequestration in the short term. However, there may be a need for restoration and rehabilitation. In the Northeast, many of the northern hardwood forests, for example, have a history of exploitative logging that has reduced stocking and And those stands are relatively understocked. There's exploitative logging, things like beech bark disease and other disturbances that have reduced carbon storage, carbon stocks, and therefore the rate at which the forest can sequester carbon. So there may be a need for restoration and rehabilitation in those northern hardwood stands. Additionally, we may have degradation in site quality as a result of acid rain or a history of agriculture and the removal of soil organic matter and reduction in site fertility. Climate change can result in reduced productivity and site quality for a given tree species. And finally, a regeneration lag can reduce the rate at which a stand can perform and sequester carbon over time. And that's a big issue in the Northeast. For example, because of deer, here's a northern hardwood stand in the Catskills at the Frost Valley YMCA. And here a regeneration harvest was implemented, but you can see on the left, there's no regeneration. Instead, we have hay-scented fern just kind of taking over, as well as American beech. And these are species that deer don't like to eat, coincidentally. And on the other side, we have a picture of that same harvest where there's been a deer exposure. And you can see that regeneration is abundant there. So here's that side by side again. You can see within the regeneration, within the deer exposure, there's lots of regeneration. So deer and other issues like beech bark disease and competition from beech saplings and sprouts in the understory are causing major regeneration lags and limit the productivity and the ability of northern hardwood forests to sequester and store carbon. In contrast, if you think about a system like a fire-dependent system like the New Jersey Pine Barrens, where fire maybe has been excluded, you can have overstocked stands. So these are stands that are sequestering high carbon stocks, and they're sequestering carbon at their maximum rate. But they're doing this because fire was excluded. And there are some costs to this. So there's a cost, we're talking to the Audubon Society, there's a cost in biodiversity and all the birds and plants and insects that depend on the conditions that are created by fire, that heterogeneity, that openness. Additionally, the high levels of stocking can cause additional forest health problems and make those trees more susceptible to insect disturbance and drought, and a whole host of issues. Maintaining forests at full site occupancy or full stocking is not appropriate in all stands and at all times. And it can result in some trade-offs between managing forests for carbon and managing forests for biodiversity that we need to keep in mind as we think about, well, how do we rise to the challenge of managing for carbon sequestration and storage. So this approach of maintaining forests at full stocking, high levels of stocking, and maximizing rates of timber production is consistent with our conventional silvicultural management, which focuses on truncating conditions and narrowing options for the future and really maximizing rates of growth in timber production. And this can be applied. We have all these tools that we can apply to carbon management. However, given the uncertainty we face with climate change, this might not be the best approach. For example, the trees might be maladapted to the already changed and continuing to change conditions. Some species may perform better than others. So we need to consider a bet hedging approach where we manage forests for a broader range of ecosystem characteristics, species composition, species diversity, gaps, overstory gaps that allow species of different shade tolerances to regenerate. That's a very important tool for us that we don't want to throw out. However, we have climate change outpacing tree migration. The rate at which species can migrate and colonize new sites, that's been well known for a long time, that the rate of climate change outpaces the rate at which trees can move to suitable locations. So we also need to consider strategies like assisted migration, whether those are populations or different species, where we're extending their range or just moving them entirely, bringing southern pines into New Jersey, for example. And these different strategies may have different trade-offs and effects on carbon storage versus sequestration. And we're examining these alternative strategies through a new experiment with my colleagues at SUNY ESF. For example, we're comparing conventional silviculture, which might focus on maintaining high levels of stocking to, in the near term, with transition and restoration and rehabilitation, which can increase sequestration in the near term. And we compare these to a no action or do nothing scenario. And it's called adaptive capacity through silviculture because these new transition and restoration and rehabilitation strategies focus on that bet hedging approach and building adaptive capacity. So building the capacity of forests to adapt to new and changing conditions relative to conventional. And the acronym ACTS kind of begs the question, like, can we get away with doing nothing? Or do we need to do something, and do we need to do something now? So this is a new experiment that I'm working on with colleagues at SUNY ESF that I'm hoping and likely to be able to replicate here in Houghton, Michigan, and the UP where I am now. And these, there might be some initial trade-offs, but we expect these trade-offs to maybe switch over time as the climate changes. So there are different strategies that we can use to focus on maintaining and increasing carbon sequestration and storage. We have to consider potential trade-offs and effects on other very important management objectives. And, we always end up saying whether the conversations about carbon storage or timber production or old growth forests, a mix of strategies is probably the best approach. So thank you very much for having me here and for your attention.
Thank you, Julia. Again, another interesting talk. And our next speaker was also our introductory speaker. So Bernie, take it away.
All right, well, thank you. We should be able to see, hopefully, part two. Thanks for the introduction. And I really was glad to hear a lot of the points brought up by Robert and by Karina and by Julia. So right now I'm going to try and bring some of those home to numbers in New Jersey and context here. So I think it was Karina that pointed out that the below ground pool contains it's probably the largest pool. So the numbers that we have here on the left are statewide assessments. They're all in metric tons. On the right is in short tons. So one of the reasons, it was a mistake. I didn't mean to do it that way when I made the figure, but then I realized, what, here's a good learning point. A lot of times when we're talking about carbon, you'll hear things that sound maybe too good to be true, and it's important to be consistent in units, be consistent in what it is you're defining. So everything I'm going to present to you here is in metric tons, aside from the one on the right, metric tons of carbon. That's not the same as CO2 equivalent, right? Because CO2 equivalent, you're including those 2 oxygen atoms, so it makes it heavier. And on the right there is in tons as opposed to metric tons. All right, so that being said, so the statewide pool, the above ground and below ground are about the same size, although that below ground number is probably an underestimate because it doesn't go all the way down as far as you can into the soil. But so they're both about 55 million metric tons is the size of the pool. And then each of those individually is bigger than the other 3 pools combined. These are the 5 reporting pools that are used by U.S. Forest Service Forest Inventory Analysis, international reporting. The statewide annual flux is about 500,000 metric tons of carbon per year. So that's that annual flux, right? That change to the pool net. And then growth to removals. This is using slightly older data. Everything else is 2019, but the growth to removals is 2018 data. And so net growth, so that's growth after you've subtracted off mortality. The amount of growth that we have in proportion to harvest or in proportion to removals from other causes, it's about 7 to 1. So out of every 8 units of carbon, I should say, out of every 7 units of carbon that are being added to our forest, you've got an additional unit that's been removed, that 8th unit. All right, so let's look at a distribution of where that occurs. So each that we have here, each square is about 100,000 metric tons of carbon. So the top there is above ground, live, below ground, soil organic is the brown on the bottom. And you can see those are both, those are the vast majority of the carbon that we have in our ecosystems, but they're a little bit, there are some other pools. Also, so the highlands, the pool that exists in the highlands is there on the left in blue-gray. On the right is the pinelands there in the sort of green. And so you can see just between those 2 jurisdictional planning regions, we've covered about half of all the carbon in New Jersey's forests. So now we're looking at area. So each square here represents 1,000 acres of forest. So not the same thing, right? From that figure that we saw a couple of figures ago of the map, right? There's different densities depending on where you are. But we're going to look at area right now for the point of understanding overlapping jurisdiction, which loops back to the points that Julia made and that Karina made about managing for different interests. So if each square here represents 1,000 acres of forest, we've got our upland forest in yellow and wetland forest in blue. We've already got almost a third of the forest resource in New Jersey by area is regulated by the Freshwater Wetlands Protection Act. So it's got a special body already considering why we have those forests and what we should be doing with them. If we add on to that the highlands, that eats up some more of the upland acreage. We have some overlap in wetlands. Add on the pinelands, another commission, which is about a third by area. And on public land. So this is all land that's owned by a government entity. This doesn't include, my apologies to Audubon and NJCF and other nonprofit landowners. This doesn't include those lands. This is just through that public policy process. The goals for open space and how that is governed. And then this is the threatened and endangered species habitat from the New Jersey Division of Fish and Wildlife Endangered Non-Game Species Program, Landscape Project version 3.3. So this is all the habitat that's listed as threatened, state endangered, or federally endangered. And so you can see that almost all of the forest has some forest resource by area, has at least one of these 5 additional designations. So there's a couple ways to interpret that, but I think the really valuable ones are, one, there's different legal pathways and there's different avenues to affect policy that could affect carbon. And the other is, two, that there's a lot more interest than just carbon, right? Some of these lands were either purchased or designated this way for very specific reasons. Those reasons being articulated in the enabling documents for, say, like the Pinelands Commission. So it's more than just being managed for carbon. It needs to be managed in balance, like Julia said, lots of strategies for lots of things. All right, so here's a figure. This is a tree map. So we're looking at area again. So this is area of forest by forest type group. So the white label with the thick black line is the forest type group, U.S. Forest Service, Forest Inventory Analysis type group. And the smaller boxes with the black labels are forest type. So it's more specific. The 2 large types by area, or type groups by area in New Jersey, are the oak hickory group and the loblolly shortleaf pine group, which is basically pitch pine. So by area, those are our two big big forest groups. By carbon pool, so this is scaled differently. You see that oak hickory grew in size in proportion to its area, and the pitch pine or the loblolly shortleaf one shrank in size in proportion to its area. So in terms of the carbon pool, oak hickory forests, occupy the largest chunk of our carbon pool in the state. So those were pools, which is different than flux, right? So flux being the rate the rate of change. So each of these, I should have labeled the x-axis there with the previous colors. But so we're looking at the forest type groups. The green is gross growth. So in order to figure out the net growth, you'd have to subtract off the gray, which is mortality for each of those. And then that sort of purpley blue is the amount of harvest. And so that 7-to-1 growth to removals, if you go on the right, you look at the statewide total for the above ground biomass flux. I shouldn't say above ground biomass is a little bit confusing because I say it's metric tons. This has been converted to metric tons of carbon. So it's not just biomass. So if you subtract that gray off of that green, and then you take the remaining green and divide it, how many of those purple bars can you fit in there? That's where the 7-to-1 comes from. So this is showing you that there are certain types that sequester more, have a higher flux rate. So to come back to some of the points made by the previous speakers, one of which is climate resilience. This is something that, having walked a lot of the woods in North Jersey, something that jumped out at me. So we're looking at diameter distributions of functional groups, forest functional groups, in the highlands and the skylands. So this is stratified by those two, everything outside of the Piedmont, north of the Piedmont. The x-axis here is diameter class, so it's size of tree. And then the y-axis is average basal area per acre, so region-wide. So this is, you can think of this as sort of how much of the forest occupancy is occupied by those groups. So you see that orange curve, that's the highest and sort of the rightmost peak, that's oaks and hickories. So that's why a lot of our forest is dominated by, right? It's oak hickory forest type group. That's why you've got lots of overstory oak and hickory. But coming right behind those on the left there is that blue, that maple beech birch. So those are species that they're shade tolerant. They are more mesic adapted. And as far as future climate and predictions for future climate, they are the ones that we're expecting to not do as well, to be more stressed. So it would be a less resilient landscape if we leave things the way they are with the trajectory. The green down there is conifers, and the gray is all other species. And I'll point out, so you say, oh, well, maybe other species will fill in. If we remove the ash trees, which is happening as we speak, not intentionally, it's really sort of a two-player game. The oaks and hickories versus these sort of more mesic species. And that has really profound implications for the trajectory of the forests in North Jersey in particular, for what they're going to look like and what kind of condition they'll be in to be resilient on the face of climate change. All right, so I put this one in here. This is hopefully somewhat alarming and also an interesting way of looking at this. So if we take that carbon equivalent, the mass of carbon per acre, per person per year across the state, that's the carbon equivalent in terms of the carbon in gasoline to about 7 5-gallon gas cans, about 34, 35 gallons per person per year is what our forest sequesters in New Jersey. In some parts of New Jersey, that's wonderful. We think a forest is offsetting that amount of carbon. So think of North Jersey, or in places where there's maybe a different risk of disturbance, where adding carbon might not increase the risk of losing that pool. So that's in contrast to maybe South Jersey, particularly lots of parts of the Pinelands, where adding that kind of carbon really is adding fuel to a wildfire danger, a wildfire threat. The forests that we have today, they're the result of 100 years of conservation, more than 100 years in some places. It took a long time for that carbon pool to be built up and for that resource with all the different aspects of it, whether it be biodiversity, for water recharge, rare plants. No, I guess that's biodiversity. But it took a long time for that to grow up. If we we decrease the stability of that by adding to that pool, like kind of Julia talked about, pine forest having the danger of being overstocked, we increase the volatility of that pool and we maybe decrease its stability. That's a really big concern for me. And as far as Karina's point about beetles, absolutely. The main thing keeping the lid on southern pine beetle in New Jersey right now is having just a few cold nights a year, those low single digit nights. And if we lose those winter minimums, now we've got a forest where the trees are competing with each other. They're approaching that size density threshold, and they're at much higher risk for losses from competition and beetles. The beetles are doing better when there's more competition. So with that, I just wanted to close with some data sources. So if you've got the print screen function on your computer, whether it be print screen or alt print screen, usually to the right of those F function buttons, hit it now if you're interested in any of these resources and you want to get a chance to try your hand at doing your own eValidator queries, or messing around in the U.S. Forest Service FIA database. Again, print screen. I'm going to count down and then I'm going to stop sharing. 3, 2, print screen. Hit that print screen. 2, 1. All right. And we'll stop share there. Thanks for listening.
Thanks. I just made it with the print screen. So now I'll have those links as well. And of course, this whole thing is being recorded. So if anyone has missed anything, I'll be sending out the link to the recording afterwards. But now it is time for the Q&A. And throughout the webinar, there have been some really good and thoughtful questions coming in. And I'm going to turn it over to New Jersey Audubon's Policy Director, Drew Tompkins.
Excellent. Yeah, thanks so much to our presenters for all the great presentations. We do have quite a few questions that came in. I'm going to try to go in order, but I think a few of these I can collapse together. So the first question that I want to pose that came up pretty early on, so this came up during Robert, your presentation, isn't the difference between past climate change and current climate crisis that the current change is happening at a much more accelerated rate, far faster than ecosystems can actually adapt to change? And I'm guessing from that question, is there something we should do about that? And anybody else who wants to jump in as well, but start with Dr. Mendelsohn.
It's certainly true that climate change is going faster now than it did if we were worried about things like the glacial cycle. But the current rate of 0.1 degrees Celsius per decade has actually been going on for a long time. It's been going on for centuries. So in some sense, this is also part of a natural cycle. It's what we're worried about is whether it will accelerate in the future if we keep doing more and more emissions. And there definitely are scenarios where if we continue to accelerate emissions, climate change will increase faster than trees can possibly adapt. And that's where talking about the questions were discussed before about whether there's something that we can do in forest management to help forests adapt more quickly is actually an important part of this discussion. So I'll hand this over to my colleagues to continue this. Julie or Bernie, do you want to say something more about this?
Sorry. So it's very important that we consider strategies like assisted migration to account for the fact that the climate is changing faster than the trees can migrate to new suitable locations. So that's looking at the transition strategy. So if we're talking about a northern hardwood forest, this might involve enriching it with oaks and hickories, trying to convert it to an oak hickory type that is better adapted to future climate conditions, but also thinking about the changes that have already occurred. Thinking about these trees are 80 to 90 years old, so the climate was much different when those trees were established and when they regenerated than it is today. So right now, like regenerating little tiny tree seedlings might not be able to regenerate in today's climate the way that they did 90 years ago when those trees established. So thinking about strategies of reintroducing new species, assisted range expansion, assisted migration to transition the forest to be adapted to current and future climate conditions.
Yeah, there is precedent for that too within the state. So the example I'm thinking of, some of the plantations. So, for instance, the plantations around the fire tower and Bass River were established. A lot of them were established in the 19-teens. It was a French farm was the name of the place. And when the public acquired it as a demonstration area, they planted lots of different species. European larch, Norway spruce, lava pine. They planted ponderosa, I think, too, from the records I've seen. And so there's been an effort to sort of explore. The reason they were doing this for, what would be commercial, to demonstrate what would be commercial species in New Jersey. And so, we don't have to necessarily think about it as being commercial, but the idea being that there's a precedent that we as a society have definitely brought loads of different kinds of species to our land. I think there's always a push and pull between wanting to preserve biodiversity, existing biodiversity, and then also, adapt to climate change. And so to Julia's point, assisted migration, it doesn't have to be, we don't have to be planting like eucalyptus plantations, I've seen in southern New Jersey, pines from other parts of the coastal plain further south. So longleaf pine doing just fine here. And so the conditions that grew the forests that we have today, those were the conditions, as Julia pointed out, when those seedlings got started, 80, 90, 100 years ago. The conditions that we're going to have in 100 years, we should be thinking about now for if we're taking an active role in management. But yeah, I mean, like the rate of change and our ability, it's not just the rate of change too in terms of time. To Karina's point about fragmentation, so intact ecosystems, I saw some of the comments too about deer and invasive species. Yeah, there's a lot of challenges to regenerating our forests. And so if we're going to have to resort to artificial means, or if we're going to have to resort to a lot of pressure, doing things like whether it be thinking about introducing predators or increasing hunting, do what we can to shift these things. We should also be putting on the table those other options for species diversity.
Great, thanks so much. And building off of that, what you just said, Bernie, we did get quite a few questions about invasive species and especially deer management problems and how we can manage in order to overcome those challenges, and if that's possible to do. So if anyone can speak to that, especially where we're seeing this in the north as well as in the south with the pine beetle and everything, how we can manage to make sure we're not just basically coming in with a bunch of invasive species that deer don't want to eat and aren't as productive from a climate standpoint at sequestering carbon, et cetera. And I'll open up to anybody.
Well, so seeing the opportunity here. So if deer don't eat them, it's not necessarily bad for climate, right? Depending on the tree species, if deer don't eat it, it could be something that's really resilient in the face of deer. I mean, if we're talking about things that are inhibiting regeneration, so shrubs or vines that don't have the potential for biomass, the same potential for biomass on the site that trees have, that absolutely invasives could be a problem. But there might be species that we would consider to be invasive that are doing just fine because deer don't eat them. But in terms of the different concerns, this is kind of going to be an asymmetric answer. But so that slide I had on there about where the firewood comes from, I actually think that one of the things that would be most helpful to us in dealing with this was getting people to have the consequences of their natural resource choices and actions be seen in their own environment, their own daily environment. Because I feel like, I don't know, speaking with lots of different stakeholders and lots of different people and hearing from people, it makes me actually really hopeful about climate and about our forests, because people are really responsive and want to do something when they see a problem. They have to see it though. And so in my mind, one of the ways that we can deal with deer and deal with invasives, is to make that something. And the reason people are talking about this is because those are things that they see. So if there were a way for us to increase sort of that communication, that feedback loop between what people are seeing and what their actions are doing to the land, I feel like actually that's how we'll deal with all of these issues. But it's sort of a broader answer.
Does anybody else want to jump in or move on to the next question? I guess we'll move on, and I'm trying to go slightly in order of the presentations and collapse things down. So this next question I think is for Robert. Biochar is a way to remove carbon now as a soil amendment breaks down very slowly. Why wait until mid-century to encourage this is the question, going back to your presentation about, I believe, carbon capture and storage.
Okay, so the carbon capture and storage, when you do it on a big scale, turns out to be a very expensive enterprise. So it's going to cost, the capture and storage part of it is going to cost over $100 a ton. And so right now, while we're kind of thinking that we can do lots of mitigation for $10 or $25 a ton, it doesn't seem like it makes sense to spend a vast amount of money on getting rid of just a few tons. So that's one of the reasons we're thinking about delaying this. But the other reason is that it turns out that the sequestration part of forestry, the fact that we are not storing as much carbon in most of our forests as we can, it turns out that's just a really attractive thing to do first. And one of the things that's interesting about thinking that we're eventually going to want to use the forest to withdraw carbon is that in principle, that is always going to start by storing more carbon in the forest first. That is, we're going to grow more forests in order to burn them in the long run. But what that means is right now, what we should be focusing on is growing that more forest. So part of this is just timing. In order to handle this problem over the century, the idea is to first grow those trees, and then later in the century, turn to the idea that we might store them and other mechanisms.
If I may quickly also jump into that, the issue here, though, is for all these different things, we need to look at the total carbon footprint. And this is actually something that's often not really done. And we have looked into biochar for another project. And the problem is, if you take all the different, you have to harvest it, you have to burn it, and you have to transport it, and then you bury it. You are not ever gonna get into a carbon capture. You will always actually end out having to spend more carbon than you're actually storing. So biochar itself, I think, is a ill-guided, if you look into the entire carbon footprint. And that's also with all the other different things. Harvesting a wood product is okay, but if you look again at the total carbon footprint, you will not come out ahead. And that is something where we are really having to look hard. Likewise, actually, with agriculture, there's the whole thing with regenerative agriculture, etc. Agriculture per se will never draw out CO2. We will maybe get carbon zero if we take into nitrous oxide and methane and everything else into account. So we really need to look at the entire picture before we get to any measures.
Yeah, Karina actually brings up a very good point. That that's another reason why doing some of these actions today might not make sense, even though they'll make sense in the future. That right now we have a very fossil fuel intensive energy source. So anytime we want to do something like go and harvest things, go move them around, transport them, we're going to be actually burning a lot of fossil fuels in that process because our current system is fossil fuel intensive. But what's going to happen as we gradually move away from fossil fuels and towards much more renewable sources of energy is that's no longer going to be the case. So in the future, the idea is we'll be using renewable energy to do all these things. And so it will actually work in the future, even though, as Katrina was pointing out, it might not be such a great idea right now.
Next question is for, I think, Karina to start, and if others want to jump in. Had a couple questions about this, about your definition, description of intact forest. A few things came up in the in the chat, whether it be the U.S. Forest Service and the land data on them. And so just how you're defining it, for instance, the Newark watershed in New Jersey has over 30,000 acres of forest where no harvesting has occurred since at least the 70s. So just that definition, saying there's no intact forest at all in New Jersey. Some other people just mentioned the highlands and pinelands separately. So yeah, if you could just define that a little clearer, I think there was some confusion around that.
So the way it is defined and how it is actually then also shown in the figure, and again, I can pop or distribute the Google Earth Engine to that, is the intact forest would require that you have contiguous forest. That means as soon as you have a road, it's not intact anymore. So that's one thing that we have to also think about. Then you have to have understory growth that enables you. So the definition is having at least trees that are a minimum of 5 meters tall in the area, and the contiguousness, so to speak, is also that you have different layers of the canopy. So if one tree will fall over, that you still have total canopy cover. And as we mentioned already in terms of understory and regrowth and regeneration, because of the deer pressure that we have, there's very, very few places where we do have it. A lot of the forest that we know here is not intact because it is already so denuded and browsed by deer. We don't know better. We don't simply know in New Jersey better. So if you're welcome to go to these forests further north, because you have different stories, we as we call canopy layers. You have healthy regeneration, you have no roads cutting through. That's also my argument with fragmentation. And in earlier when our panel met yesterday, we talked about that already. Because we are built up state, because we are such a high population density, there's a lot of fragmentation. So contiguous, it's really in a 30 by 30 meter pixel as the LiDAR as they have used. You would not see any roads, you would have these different canopy layers, et cetera, et cetera. So yeah, I mean, again, we have altered, and we have only secondary growth forest in US left. That is also something we have to look at it historically, that we have harvested, burned so many times over that we don't even have primary forests anymore, for example. So there's a lot of these different issues. And from an ecological standpoint, the intactness of a forest is A, no fragmentation, no gaps, no roads, etc. And B, having the different canopy layers, etc. So yeah, a lot of times when we think of a forest, we just walk in and have a nice hike, and we don't really think of the ecological factors that are going into defining these sorts of things. So yes, I'm aware that that is a difficult concept to grasp because we actually haven't seen those sorts of forests here anymore. And so the global analysis actually shows it's only the boreal forests in Canada, Russia, and some of the Amazon that's basically left and intact.
So I'd like to jump in about definitions here and scale. I think that there's there's a few things. So one, the ecological fallacy, what's happening for a population might not be true in every location. So where that comes in with scale is that if we're seeing by that definition by Kriener's definition of intact, what you might have in a local spot, if you don't have it across a landscape, then that would be defined as not intact according to, I think, how Kriener is defining it. But I think what would be important to think about is, instead of thinking about the labels that we put on there or scale-dependent designations, is when you walk into a forest, is this forest, are the processes that make that forest stay forested and stay resilient for climate and for being able to sequester carbon, are those processes going on? So are there conditions for germination of new individuals? are any of those individuals making it into the canopy? There's a whole range of different processes. Is the forest, does net growth exceed net mortality? Those are the questions. And there are absolutely locations within New Jersey where despite having an overstory disturbance, whether it's intentional or not, that you are getting regeneration, that we are seeing growth. The light environment matters a whole lot. What species come in. If you disturb an area significantly enough, you will change the palette of species that will grow there, including the tree species, native tree species. Some ones are more shade intolerant and they need that disturbance. And so you're not going to get growth from them. You're not going to get a response under a canopy, regardless of whether there are deer there or not. So the thing to think about for whether these ecosystems are, rather than, to me, thinking an intact forest has less to do with a scale dependent designation, but more to do with the function, and asking, with your ecological eye, when you go out there, am I seeing different phases of a forest's life cycle, a tree's life cycle? Am I seeing those things? And by that approach, I actually think there's a lot of room for hope that we may not have the large tracts that are baked into the concept of wilderness that exists here in New Jersey or in the United States. We may not have those here, but do we have intact forests that are acting as ecosystems that have the different processes that allow them to continue? Yes, in a lot of places we do. It's not, it's not hopeless doom and gloom, and we're not going to have any forests. We do have places, but that doesn't mean that it's solved everywhere. It doesn't mean that we've got great regeneration everywhere. We certainly don't, but it's very area specific.
Yeah, I mean, the gap is an important tool and a mechanism of tree regeneration, that we've known about for decades, right? We know that gaps are important. We know that if we want to regenerate yellow birch in a northern hardwood forest, we need a larger gap. We need a seed source, and we need a good seed bed for that seedling to establish on. And I think, what's going on here is that the studies that Katrina's referencing from Europe are showing that within these openings, we're seeing that these openings are kind of triggering the transition from a species composition, a plant community that's adapted to historical conditions, that's been there a long time. So these gaps are triggering the transition to warmer adapted species, particularly in the herbaceous layer, right? So there's one way to think about that as like, oh no, we're losing our flora. Another way to think about it is like the gaps are an adaptive mechanism. So that's when we're going to see that adaptation take place, adaptation to climate change. And if there's no trees there, because the trees can't migrate very fast, we lose opportunities to adapt. And that's where we have to consider these assisted migration strategies.
Thanks so much. I think we have time for maybe one more question. I know we are, I think, basically over time, but I think there's a couple questions that fit together here, and I just want to, bring them to everybody at the end. One thing that's, I think, really interesting to a lot of the attendees is the concept of species migration, which you were just bringing up there, Julia, and how we may see different species, i.e. southern species, moving further north in the face of climate change in order to sequester more carbon, et cetera. And how do we best manage, I know this is probably the biggest question of all, how do we best manage for all of these different aspects that we are looking at, whether it be carbon versus ecosystem, et cetera, with the idea of new species moving in and also potentially needing to help those species move, further north. Again, a very big question, lots of stuff there. So if everybody can maybe put their 2 cents in, and maybe this will be the best closing answer ever, and you'll solve all the world's forest problems.
But I think one thing that everybody's been saying is that if the only thing we cared about was carbon, that there may be trade-offs. There may be other things that we'll lose in the process of just chasing carbon. So we want to be thoughtful in terms of where's the best place to do carbon management. And that's probably not throughout the entire New Jersey. It's probably there's certain parts of the New Jersey forest which are better suited for carbon management. And one of the things that is true is that if future species, as Julie was pointing out, if future species from the south are going to grow better in New Jersey in the future, that's actually going to help with carbon management, and it's going to help with long-term ecosystem preservation. So if we can very carefully harness natural forces along with our own personal social objectives, my sense is we can thoughtfully manage this problem.
Yeah, I would just kind of add to that there are multiple dimensions of carbon management. There's mitigation, adaptation, and sometimes there are some near-term trade-offs where to adapt forests to current or future climate conditions, we might have to reduce stocking levels below full site occupancy. So we're not going to be sequestering carbon at the same rate as fast as a rate. But in the long term, these forests may be more productive because they're more in sync with the climate. And that's why we can't do, we can't do that everywhere, obviously. And so that's why my main message is I think we need to embrace a mix of values of different carbon strategies, both sequestration, storage, on-site storage and harvested wood products. We need to think about the overall carbon footprint of our operations and the transportation and all the fossil fuels involved in that. It's very complex. And that's why, a mix of strategies is really the most feasible and maybe the best for maintaining these other values as well.
I'm going to reiterate and second or third those points that, just as in our type of society that we live in democracy, the diversity is our greatest strength. The forests, whether it be species of biodiversity, whether it be diversity in strategy, whether it be diversity in the ways that we look at it, right? Lots of different ways of doing it, and having a very, very wide and deep toolbox. That's the way that we achieve lots of those different objectives. We want to hear lots of different people's opinions. We want to hear lots of different objectives, because these forests, they weren't purchased. They weren't, in the case of public land, they weren't regulated. In the case of special commissions or laws, these forests that we're talking about, our communal natural resources, right? That means that the community and all the different opinions and all the different reasons and all the different interests are part of that. And I think that's going to be our greatest strength in how we deal with these, whether it be carbon or whatnot. And so, I second everything, Julia's point about strategies and having a mix. It really needs to be site appropriate, and to Robert's points too.
All right.
I'm just gonna second and third everything. And you cannot best what Bernie said, but I want to re-emphasize that we really need to value what we have and really build upon that and not destroy anything.
All right, so we are just a few minutes over, but that was a good ending question. And I think Drew did a good job of conceptualizing. There were a lot of questions, but they could be incorporated together. I think you did a nice job with that. Thank you, Drew. So thank you panelists. This was very thought-provoking, messy science, complicated. It depends, in the end, it's a complicated system, and I really do appreciate you taking the time to prepare these talks and share them with our New Jersey audience. So thank you so much, and thank you to the attendees for joining us.